trigger warnings for depictions of fictional violence featuring fictional police officers. Also, if you're allergic to context, skip to the timestamp. Hope you enjoy! Crackdown is an open-world sandbox action-adventure game developed by Real-Time Worlds and released for the Xbox 360 in 2007. It was published by Microsoft Game Studios, which was just Microsoft Games for a year before they put Studios in the name. 10 years later, they took out the game part of the name for their game publishing studio, now called Microsoft Studios, or rather ex-Microsoft Studios because it's been Xbox Game Studio since 2019. So to recap, they went from being games to Game Studios to not Game Studios back to being Game Studios with formerly known as Box.
You get it? Got it. Good.
The basic concept of Crackdown is GTA, but you're RoboCop. You play a genetically enhanced super soldier of the police force who fights 3 different criminal factions outfitted like armies. The game was pretty good for its time, and sales reflected that. It sold roughly 1.5 million copies worldwide and got a couple sequels, one of which was released in 2019, which was kind of weird. Especially since Real-Time Worlds changed its name to Ruffian Games for the release of Crackdown 2 and went bankrupt soon after finishing it. But game companies make strange decisions sometimes, so Sumo Digital buying the IP and making a third game nearly 10 years later isn't super surprising. Neither is the fact that Crackdown 3 flopped. It is surprising that Tencent bought it in 2021 after seeing someone else do the exact same thing to no avail, but whatever. Point is, this game has had a story that a lot of us will never get to know most of. I tried to get interviews with some of the folks who worked at Real-Time Worlds during Crackdown's development and came up empty. Usually it was that I couldn't find their email, but sometimes I could find an email or somewhere that seemed like a good place to reach out to them, but got no response. So you will have my biased viewpoint and very little else to go on for pretty much all of this video. I'm sorry, I tried. I was 10 years old and lived in a very white suburban household by the time Crackdown was released. While other kids were playing GTA San Andreas and making CJ phone home, I was holding my Judgy McJudge face in dismay at the idea that playing as a criminal could be fun. Then Crackdown fell into my lap and I was playing a very similar game with no reservations at all over firing a rocket into a crowd of motor vehicles. Hypocrisy is an intrinsic part of the Crackdown genre and much of this video will be spent talking about it. But there is the question of why we're talking about it at all. This game hasn't had the public eye since 2007, and even then it wasn't for very long or very closely looked at. What there is to love about it isn't exactly groundbreaking, it's a decent open world sandbox game where you play on the right side of the law. So why did I make this video? Why do we need to talk about Crackdown? Well...
Watch out, low armor! This is remarkable.
¿Qué pasó? ¿Qué?
Yeah. So the game takes place in a fictional city called Pacific City, which contains 3 gangs that have basically overrun it through crime. These gangs are Los Muertos, the Vulk, and the Shy-Gen Corporation. Each of these 3 being analogous to large organizations in our own world, basically the Mexican drug cartel, the Russian mafia, and Big Corpo respectively. And all of that is fine. In theory. In practice, the actual representation of the cultures inherently tied to some of these gangs can get a little, I don't want to use a trigger word here, but problematic. Now these gangsters are armed to the teeth and will start firefights, though only with you and each other. I've never seen them start firefights with other police, and even when they start them with you, it's usually, not exactly justified, but it makes sense. They only engage you either when you are trying to enter one of their compounds, or when you fire first, which obviously doesn't count. There are other instances where they'll just open fire on you, but usually they just walk past you. And in my playthrough, I did see the agency police and other gangs fighting each other, but I only ever arrived on the scene when they were already mid-firefight. I didn't get to see who fired the first shot, so I have no way of knowing if the police started some of these fights themselves. And all of that gets just a little suspect when we consider that each of these 3 gangs is tied to a very specific region or ethnic group, but the game does have a lot of variety in skin tone. With its playable characters, most of the people that you see walking the streets are white. But, canonically, the main character is a black guy based on every possible cutscene that's listed besides the dossiers. Those don't really feature the main character. And besides that, you've got Asian, you've got Latino, you've got all kinds of different representative properties for the main character, including white people, which I mean, no surprise there. But everything I just discussed is laying the groundwork for us to approach the police brutality in the room. Now, to be clear, these are active criminals who are heavily armed. Full force against these people is very much necessary, especially since innocents do get caught in the crossfire. The gangs will start firefights with you and each other, but they don't actually start anything with civilians. They don't actively hurt anyone present who is not armed in some way. Though that doesn't stretch to their leaders. We see a lot of video footage from the dossiers talking about the different things that the leaders of these gangs will do to civilians. So those are actually fairly cruel and definitely not following the Geneva Conventions. I suppose it's possible that that video footage was altered in some way, but I'm willing to bet that it's all real. Because if we accept the possibility that any of this is fabricated by the main character's association, we'll be here all day. All of this to say that when the game tells me that it's about a war on crime, I actually believe it. Civilians get caught up in war all the time, as recent years will have proven. Recent. Blah. But from what it looks like, all sides in this conflict are trying their best not to harm the civilian populace. No one wants to set those innocent people on fire, but if they're standing right next to not so innocent people, who can really blame us? So, to be clear, I don't think that the acts of violence you commit in this game can be considered police brutality. The force you're using is definitely necessary. Though, even when we're talking about bringing necessary force, I still feel like a genetically enhanced soldier capable of lifting and throwing a semi-truck at someone's head still might be a little more force than necessary. And again, we're talking about a game where you play as a superpowered law enforcement officer whose objective is to kill a lot of people from very specific nationalities and ethnic groups, and holy shit, I can't justify this. Look, when I was 10 and I was playing this game, I had no idea police brutality was even a thing. I was a white kid living in the suburbs. I was blissfully ignorant, as were a lot of people like me. But as we all know, it was still happening when this game was being made. So I have to believe that the people who made it were trying to say something here. I don't know what. I hope it was good. Even if it wasn't, I feel like we still need to talk about it. Especially if it was bad, in fact. Because here's the thing. Here's the main thing, alright? This game was involved with Halo 3. Halo 3 was the flagship title of the Xbox 360 console, the progenitor to the Xbox One. Halo 3 was the reason anybody bought an Xbox back then. It was the most awaited sequel of the time, and one of the most influential FPS games of all time. The game pulled in $170 million over the first 24 hours of its release. Over the first week, it pulled in over $300 million. Adjusted for inflation, those are $250 million and over $440 million respectively. And buying copies of Crackdown was one of the ways you got into the Halo 3 beta. It was the only reason I ever got it. The whole reason Crackdown sold over 1 million copies was because that many people wanted to play Halo 3. So Microsoft, Bungie, whoever decided to pair this game up with their flagship title, did it knowing that this was the game. Maybe they were as ignorant as 10-year-old me, I don't know. But because they did that, there were a lot of people who supported this game, who probably played it. Enough people for them to make 2 sequels, one of which was released in the year of our Lord, 2019. So whatever message these guys were trying to spread went pretty fucking far afield. Not to say that Crackdown had an immense effect on our cultural lexicon, it didn't. That would be stretching this video's meaning way too far. It's more like Crackdown existing the way that it did for so long without getting any amount of uproar says something about the culture that influenced its existence in the first place. That's why we need to talk about Crackdown. Not because it's important, but because this game is somehow thought of as the least important thing. When concerned mothers were talking about their kids being brought up by video games to be violent, no one talked about Crackdown. It was all the Call of Duties and the Gears of Wars. I looked for discourse about this game, and the most that I could find were a few game reviews and some Reddit threads about how the game isn't fun. There was nothing talking about its subject matter, nothing about the portrayals of the races involved, and I do want to emphasize I actually like the game in terms of gameplay. It's just the everything else bit that I have a problem with. And that everything else bit is not being discussed and has never been talked about as far as the internet is concerned. And all of that is kind of frightening to me. So we're talking about it right now. I am no longer asking. In particular, I want to talk about the game's gangs and the NPCs involved with them, because those are pretty much the main way that the game gives us our story, except for the handler, who just talks in our ear the whole time. I guess technically he's the main deliverer of the story. His narration is what brings us all of the info about these different characters, besides the videos from the dossiers and whatnot. Either way, what this means is that the gangs are going to be the best way for us to discuss what this game is actually about. Each one has one kingpin, several subordinates you can kill underneath them that will weaken them, and a couple subordinates under those subordinates that will weaken said subordinates. I'm going to go through these NPCs one by one, but because this game is probably going to get a little heavy at some points, let's lighten the mood. I'm going to rate each of these gangs on a scale from 0 to 20. I will reach this ranking by giving up to 2 points for the gang's name, how much sense it makes as a concept, how difficult the gang was to beat, and every named member of the gang itself. Because this is a full review, I'm also going to be talking about some mechanic stuff to take a break when shit gets too heavy for our little point scale to make up for it. Let's roll. So after picking the difficulty and the white cyborg dude, because it's me, we're introduced to our handler, who tells us that the world's entire police force joined together to form an organization called the Agency. Don't worry, the rest of the game makes about this much sense. Also brought up is disgraced Dr. Baltazar Chernenko's human modification program, which is being exploited to make our character, the first prototype RoboCop for the city. We'll come back to this later. Probably a lot later. We then spawn in the Keep, the agency's headquarters, where we can select from 3 agency vehicles to ride out in. I'll be going over these later too, but for now I'm gonna pick the supercar and move on. Except I'm not, because the moment the doors open, we got our first cutscene introducing our first gang, and I need to pull out the whiteboard. Our first gang is gonna be Los Muertos. Let's keep it 100. That's a shitty name. Being a white suburban male, the first thing it makes me think of is Dia de los Muertos, which I hope to God wasn't what they thought of when they first wrote that name, because wow, that is immense disrespect to show to a very popular Central American holiday to name a fucking gang after it.
The gang's death designation was originally chosen to strike fear into those who might dare stand in their way. Now their name is more associated with the consequences of their vile trade.
That explanation would work. For a bunch of white punk wannabes trying to make a gang on the south side of LA. For actual drug-dealing criminals, that is the dumbest excuse for a name I have ever heard in my entire life. 0. Said gang apparently chose to name their district La Mugre, the dirt. I should not need to explain why this is terrible. Apparently they started as a small gang in Central America and quickly became a large narcotics industry, so there's the parallels to the Mexican drug cartel. Their main notable trait is apparently their custom vehicles, which do drive nicely, I'll admit. But these are pretty damn uniform to be custom. I've seen custom cars before, and a lot of them can get stupid creative. This is a luxury sports car with an open engine. This is called a lowrider in the game files, and this is the first one without the open engine. The only part of these that looks remotely interesting is the gang emblem, and even then, it's just a yellow skull. I guess I just expected more from the gang that's supposed to specialize in custom cars, you know? I would give all of this a 1 for the started from the bottom vibes, but they called their district dirt, so 0. We drive down these underground tunnels, and can I just say, the visuals for this game are actually really good. This whole light show on the sides is really doing it for me. Then we end that underwater tunnel by flying straight out of it right into a firefight. These guys know how to make an open world shooter, especially the shooting part. The game has a skill leveling system, which was at the time pretty unique to the genre. How you kill designated enemies and get around the map rewards you with experience points in the related skill, while killing civilians or fellow policemen applies a penalty to that skill. At the beginning of the game, you're fairly weak. You can still jump a bit higher and kick a lot stronger than the average person, but you're no Superman.
I'm no Superman.
You get killed with a shot to the head, more or less the same as anyone else once your armor is gone, as opposed to when you hit 4-star strength and can shrug off headshots like it's nothing. The gun skill determines your aiming reticle's closing time, so while you can use every gun at the start, you're not exactly good at it. The enemies are all at least a little spongy compared to life, but I think that earns the game some points. Longer TTKs don't just make the game harder, they make the disconnect from reality easier. Maybe that's why this game was never called out for gun violence. You're not mowing people and aliens down like it's nothing. Every target takes some work. Unless you get a couple of headshots on them. But the fact that it's a couple just proves my point. Our first firefight spills out into the streets a bit, and it turns out our first target is right next to the Keep's tunnel entrance. Ain't that some shit? I honestly did not remember this boss being so close by, and I'm kind of upset she is, because I was hoping to have some more fun before I got violent. Said boss is Violeta Santa Maria Sanchez, the head recruiter for Los Muertos. Her methods involve luring men in with sex to then beat them as part of an initiation ritual. This is the only woman in the Los Muertos gang. There are no others. There is one instance where you see some women who have the gang symbol above their heads, as per your HUD, but I don't believe these are actual gang members for reasons I'll get into later. So this is the only woman in the entire gang, and her notable character traits apparently include being, quote, hot, dirty, deadly. All of this while either having a middle name or nickname of Santa Maria, aka the Virgin Mary. What? This is so many levels of fucked up, I really don't feel like I have to explain it. 0. For how quickly the devs wanted her to put out, though, actually getting to Sanchez is surprisingly difficult. I managed to get up there once before I'm inevitably gunned down in the process of reaching her, and that's after finding an extremely convoluted method of getting up. This is actually a good sign to me, because with a game that has a dedicated agility skill like this one does, I want to have a reason to bring it up. So many buildings and even the first area are impossible to completely scale without at least 1-star agility, and even the scalable ones require some serious attention to detail, or just sheer luck, pun intended. So because the game's been screaming at me to unlock the nearest supply point, I go do just that. Oh, supply points. Fast travel beacons that you can heal and replenish your ammo at. Nothing too special about them. This one does have an agility orb, one of the best ways to raise your agility skill, and a hidden orb right next to it. These are the two collectible orbs types in the game, and while I know a lot of people don't like collectathons, I'm actually a fan. Crackdown's agility orbs are more like Breath of the Wild's Korok seeds, in that you're not expected to get all of them, they just wanted to put enough in the game world that you'll never have to look too far to find one. The hidden orbs, though, are the complete opposite. They're usually tucked away in hard to find or at least unexpected locations, and collecting one will boost every one of your skills a little bit. But all of those skills can be boosted in other ways, most of them just by playing the game, so there's no reason to go around looking for these unless you really want an achievement. I don't give a shit about achievements, and neither should you. They look neat, though. So I go around collecting about 10 agility orbs, and by the time I have enough to reach 1-star agility, look at that! We're right by Sanchez's place. I go in there, shoot everyone in sight, wind my way up to Sanchez, and kick her until she dies. I'm still not sure if I did that because I was subconsciously roleplaying as a police officer, or because I was just that angry with the character for giving women a bad rep. So now that I'm done with Sanchez, I'm free to take out the next gang boss, which my handler kindly gave me a report on after I took back that supply point from before. Juan El Numero Martinez is both the head treasurer and head of the information network for Los Muertos, and already this isn't how a gang works. I don't care how quickly they rose to power, no gang leader is going to give one guy all control of his funding and intelligence. That's basically asking for this rando to take over. Maybe if it was a blood relative, but even then it's kinda questionable. There is no logic guiding this guy's existence, so he gets a 0. He's honestly easier to beat than Sanchez, which, coupled with his dossier being handed to you right after capturing the first supply point, suggests to me that he's meant to be your first target, even though Sanchez's compound is like, right there. The guy's so easy, he literally chooses to stand right next to explosive barrels and chooses not to die when I blow them up. So after kicking him while he's down and getting a few more supply points, I decide to try my hand at a nearby road race. There are a number of race markers throughout the game, both road and rooftop. Road races obviously raise your driving skill, while rooftop ones raise your agility. Each race has a minimum skill level to even participate though, so while they give some of your best boosts, they're not always available. And there's no benefit to doing the same race twice except for bragging rights, but this one's right around the corner from the tunnel entrance and has no skill requirement, so why not try it? Well, if you ever meet someone who doesn't seem to get why street racing is dangerous, you should have them play Crackdown. It is impossible to get a passing time on these things without crashing into somebody, which is fine when I'm driving the agency supercar because it scoops other cars straight into the air. This is both the fastest and most efficient of the 3 special cars you can drive in-game. High acceleration, high handling, you can never go wrong with the supercar. In fact, it's such a good choice, it's the only option for races like this that take place on paved roads with no steep inclines or declines. Trying to have a race when the cars are this packed is just begging me to hit something. And if this this were GTA, that'd be no problem. But I'm supposed to be a civil servant. What part of this looks civil to you? I'll admit that one's nitpicky. Following the rules of the road isn't exactly fun. But it actually matters, because this game has a heat system very much like GTA does. You don't just get in trouble with the gangs when you kill their bosses, you get in trouble with other police too. Killing civilians and fellow officers won't just raise your heat gauge with the agency, it'll decrease your skill XP. The limit to how much you can use is way lower than how much you can gain, but it still gives a mechanical reason to avoid killing people, which is impossible in these road races. Running over criminals nets me XP, but it's more of a supplement compared to what I got from races. I feel like I'm driving backwards every second I'm raising this skill up. Whatever, we hit 1-star driving and our supercar goes a little faster, let's move on. Our next boss, Jose Eltremendo Guerra, is less stupid than the others. He runs a nightclub that is apparently failing and sells drugs out of that. I said less stupid for a reason. This is still kinda dumb. Like, if the nightclub's failing, then obviously he's not gonna be able to sell a lot of drugs out of it. By the way, the handler refers to the music coming from this club at a distance as a cover for gang activity. Like, holy shit. I'm gonna give him a 1 because it makes sense that a big distributor of the drugs would be a general of the gang, but it doesn't make sense that he's a big distributor when his nightclub's failing. The raid on his place is a lot easier in traversal, but a little more tactical in terms of gameplay. There's a lot of cover and just as many enemies, and they replenish health at the same speed you do, so you have to balance safety with effectiveness. He's also the first boss I've come across where driving in is actually viable, even if it's not necessarily better than just jumping the fence and being patient as you take out his guards. Because his role in the gang makes a little sense, I decided to give him the dignity of being lit on fire, shot, and kicked to death rather than just kicking him.
Jose Guerra's timely demise spells the end of his club, and of Los Muertos' fertile drugs operation.
Wait, what? Hold up, bring in the whiteboard back. I was under the impression that this was a part of the drug running operation, not the part. You're trying to tell me that one guy who is not the Kingpin was given control of all the drugs? You know, the point of the gang? You were so close to getting your first point, Los Muertos, but unfortunately now I have to take it away from you. So after that discovery, we need to run. Yeah, you know how I mentioned the gangs have heat meters? I've got hit squads on the way, and these guys come in force. They're not more heavily armed or durable than your average criminal, but there's a lot of them, and they somehow always know where I am. I head straight to one of my supply points and teleport several blocks away, and they're still on my ass. Whatever, it's 2007, we ball. They chase me all the way to my next target, which is in some ways even more offensive than the corn hub tag. That target is Alvarez, the cheap physical trainer of Los Muertos. Why is this guy important enough to kill? Like, okay, he runs an illegal fighting ring, that's obviously bad, but how is he a big enough problem for us to be sent out for? His duties are effectively those of a drill sergeant. He doesn't have an indispensable skill. I'm sure he's a good fighter and soldier, but he's not going to destabilize the agency by any means. So get this, the reason that we're told to take this guy out is because without him, the rest of Los Muertos will be unlikely to stay in shape, which, oh boy! No matter how you slice it, this is an incredibly reductive view of Hispanic people. There's no drill sergeant type character for the agency police. No one's watching their workouts. But if no one keeps these lazy gang members in check, they're all gonna become couch potatoes? No. Fuck that. But you're talking about police. They have stricter regiments. No, they fucking don't. Remember, we are looking at a literal drug war being fought on 3 fronts. It wouldn't be called a war if all the soldiers on one of those fronts would happily skip leg day. Fucking zero. At least taking this guy down is interesting. Every boss we've faced so far has been more challenging to get to than actually kill, except for Guerra, who just took a while to get to. This guy seems to have known you were coming because rather than simply hanging out in his compound, he's decided to hide away in a convenient rock formation on the beach behind it. This makes things a bit harder. He's put himself in a situation where I have to fight him on his terms. And when his compound is actually pretty well defended this time, that means I have to try something new. So I break out the SUV. The agency SUV basically exists for off-road travel, doing tricks, and going through stunt markers. When you need the armor of a vehicle and the maneuverability of a person, this car attempts to do both. I say attempts to because the game's camera makes it really difficult to handle this thing. You're not allowed to look up or down when you're in a car. Most of the time that's fine because most of the time you're driving on roads. Even if the cam's still a little tight in these situations, it's at least livable. But trying to climb a bunch of rocks or a mountain without being able to see where you're going means you have no easy way to angle yourself and will inevitably fall to the ground. It's still basically the only way you'll pass through stunt markers that will, again, give you a boost to your driving skill, but I'm starting to wonder when that skill will ever be necessary to use. Driving a car is always faster than going on foot, provided you don't have a mountain of obstacles in the way, but wouldn't you know it, this game is set in a city, where there's always a ton of cars on the road, which would still make driving viable because a slow drive is still much faster than a brisk walk, except the presence of the agility skill renders that argument pretty moot. Who cares if you can move 50 miles per hour when you're always moving 10? Especially when I'm always running 20 across rooftops, making a straighter path to my destination while avoiding traffic. And collecting orbs that will eventually increase my movement speed on the way there. This is why I went straight for the supercar at the start. It's a fast car with good handling that plows through obstacles. It's the only car worth driving in the entire game unless you like doing backflips. Which, more power to you, but that's not going to help you go anywhere, and it's not going to help you kill any bosses anytime soon. So I climbed the rocks the old-fashioned way and introduced my new gym buddies to legwork. Then I remember that I haven't been using grenades much, and there seem to be crowds in the distance. The default grenade is fine, I guess, nothing to write home about, though it's funny when I throw it at someone's head. I managed to scare a drug cartel strongman out of his hidey hole, set him on fire with grenades somehow, and shoot him a bunch until he dies. Sure. Realizing that I just took out the last target on this island, I start swimming for the next one. Lemugre's North Island has little to no civilization compared to the South one, which means my 1 star in agility is going to be more than enough to get everywhere I need to go with incredible ease. I know I said there are some buildings you need higher agility for, and I am kinda right, but the jump from 0 to 1 star is huge enough that it takes a long while to need any more than that. And even when you do, it's usually because you're a few feet away from your next handhold rather than a fucking mile. My 10 base orbs are so sufficient I can sneak up on a man in a lighthouse with them. Gonzalez is the first member of the gang that actually makes sense. He manages the gang's weapons trafficking, which is an important role that you could expect a general to fulfill. It's also something that could be weakened using the flow of money. You want to stop your guys from shooting at your other guys? The best way to do that is to stop giving everyone bullets. Weapons trafficking is also something that you would expect would take a while for somebody to develop just through watching another person do it. Which means there's probably not somebody that could immediately replace this guy if he gets killed. It makes sense for him to be there, it makes sense for us killing him to have an effect on the gang. Actually getting to him is not easy, you cannot do a frontal assault and succeed. No notes, he's great, too. Thanks to my super jump, I managed to get to the tip top of the lighthouse, which is a fair bit above Gonzalez himself. Then, using one of the sniper rifles I got from his men on the way up, I inch my way to the edge to get a good angle on him and calmly shoot him in the head several times. The Long Eye is one of 2 sniper rifles in the game. Reloading takes a while, but the fact that this thing hurts as much as it does and has 5 bullets every reload still makes it seriously good. Gonzalez himself uses it, and he's a gun nut, meaning once I burn all my ammo on him, I can drop down to his perch and clear an escape route using all the ammo he couldn't use on me. We're at the second to last boss for Los Muertos. It's just this guy and the Kingpin, and they just couldn't end it off on a good note. Diaz is basically a diva, but for cars. He has exacting standards that the custom cars of Los Muertos are expected to meet. He is the guy running car theft and distribution, of course, but mostly he's a car designer. And once he's killed off, the, quote, choice of base cars becomes poor and modifications substandard. Trafficking in weapons is a skill that would obviously take a long time to learn just through watching someone else do it. Anyone involved with Diaz would be able to learn how to do what he does just by watching him. Car guys love cars, and cars are not actually that difficult to figure out. The reason that companies like Ford and Tesla guard their secrets like gold is because anybody could replicate them if they wanted to. And, knew how. The fact that killing Diaz matters at all means there's no one to immediately replace him. If there's no one to immediately replace him, that means that the people under him didn't learn how to do what he does. And if they didn't learn how to do what he does, that implies that they either couldn't or didn't care to. Like they're too stupid or didn't bother. Most people who work on cars tend to love working on cars. And if they don't love working on cars at the start, they learn to love it by the end. So the implication here is that Diaz's men are either too incompetent to do his job, or aren't passionate enough about cars to take his job. Both of these are highly offensive things for the game to suggest, so 0. Unfortunately, what Diaz lacks in proper writing, he makes up for in boss design. This guy was annoyingly hard to kill. His dome has a huge hole in it, which makes taking out Gonzalez first a must so you get the sniper rifle and can use the height to your advantage. And while there's a lot of dudes in here, they're all pretty spread out, so there's a surprising amount of places to take cover. So, what's the problem? Well, apparently the devs really wanted there to be one boss you kinda need to use cars against because this asshole has the literal best gun in the entire game. The Harlington HMG surpasses every other gun in terms of raw DPS. You can debate that headshots with a sniper rifle are faster, but that debate is lost the moment you deal with the huge boss health pools. It fires for longer, has negligible accuracy difference, takes just as long to reload, and also tears through your armor when someone's using it against you. And once your armor's gone, it's like a speed run to write your own will before a stray bullet clips your thigh. I'm lucky I managed to pick up my own Harlington at one of the supply points nearby, but just having the same gun doesn't make this nearly an even playing field. My armor and his HP go down at about the same rate. He has more health than I do, and I'd like to reiterate that once I start bleeding, I might as well be paper mache. But this is a car garage. There are sort of armored vehicles all around me, so I try ducking into one of those. I am driving on sand. The handling is terrible. I can't hit anybody with this thing. I am in hell. Somewhere along my many attempts, I get a silly idea. I decide to test the game's enemy spawn mechanics, see if there's a Dark Souls thing going on where getting more ammo means all the enemies are back up. So I take a sniping trip, then run back for more bullets, and it's not exactly Dark Souls. Some of the guys respawned, and some of them didn't. This still feels like a fight, but it feels a lot more manageable than the rain of bullets I was getting before. I clear a path and hop into a sports car, only for one of the wheels to get popped on my way to Diaz. So at this point, I say, fuck it. I have 2-star guns, maybe that makes enough of a difference. Turns out it doesn't. But kicking him into the ground before I fire on him does. Who would have thought that shooting someone who can't shoot back would be so effective? I'm surprised there aren't more policemen doing this. Which leaves us with the Don himself, Domingo Garcia. We don't really get a lot about him, except he's like super dangerous and he has that sick robot arm. We also learn that his elite guard is called Los Hombres. He's kind of inoffensive. I don't really have much of a problem with him. He just seems like a cool dude who runs a gang and is ruthless and gruff. Better than most of these bosses, too, I guess. His base isn't all that well defended, which the game tells me is because I took out all the generals first, but really it's because he's by the water. Oh yeah, swimming in this game is incredibly broken. One of the most effective ways to take out your target is to get to them really quickly and with minimal obstacles, and for whatever reason, the enemies in this game never think to look in the water. The first time I swim in this cave, I managed to get all the way to Garcia before he kills me, and not himself, with a grenade thrown at his feet. The second time I do it, I throw every grenade in my inventory, which all do nothing to him, so I just shoot him a bunch. Also, just to be clear, I wasn't sure whether killing his generals made any difference at all, so I went ahead and redid this one in cheat mode. I could have given myself 4-star in every skill, and even more than that in agility and strength, but for accuracy I just approximated my skill levels in campaign and gave myself the same weapons. And the fight was not really any different. Every enemy had an extra health bar, which initially got me concerned, but the Harlington chewed through all of them fast enough that it didn't matter. The grenade still did enough damage and kept Garcia down long enough for me to take him out before anything else became a problem. So at least in this case, it doesn't seem like there's much of a reason to bother taking out the generals before the Kingpin. But you have to take them all out anyway to beat the entire gang, so we might as well do it as intended. There's one last fight before Los Muertos is out of the picture, and that's Funland. Once all the leaders are dead, each gang will have a final show of force at a well-populated location in their district. Take out all gang members involved, and the gang is pronounced dead, and the district gets renamed. The last fight isn't much of one. Throw a few bombs, shoot a few guys, kick the last one to send them off right. The district then gets renamed to Green Bay after one of the agency's founders, probably more of a reference to the developers. Maybe one of them was a Packers fan. More importantly for me is the presence of a foot race. I mentioned before that the main ways you get agility levels are by picking up orbs and completing rooftop races, and that's mostly true. You do get a small amount when you kill an enemy while you have a height advantage, but it's barely noticeable. On paper, this is a really good idea. Finding and reaching an orb feels nice, particularly if your current jump didn't make it easy. There's a lot of interesting ways to make use of the jump to access areas you probably shouldn't be able to. I also like how the improvements in jump height are handled, because there are a lot of things you feel like you can jump to at lower levels that you're just short of, which encourages the player to go elsewhere and find more orbs or foot races to complete before coming back to collect these. It's a good way to direct your players in a sandbox game, and if you do manage to find a way up there without taking the obvious route, the game's not gonna rip the orb out from under you. So yeah, the jump and agility orbs are pretty great. but the movement is clunky as hell, and I hate it. You know how I said getting to the orbs early feels like an accomplishment? Well, there are some instances where getting to where you need to go feels like a puzzle, and in these moments, the orbs work well. But there are other times where you know what you need to do, or at least something that might work, but the running is so fucking twitchy that you fall right off the tiny ledge you found to work your magic with. You push the stick a millimeter to the side when you move, and this bastard just goes flying. This can make it seem like there are a lot of ledges with orbs hanging on them that you can probably reach at your level if you're creative about how you do it. So you try and try and try again because every time you feel like the character's movements are fucking you up. And sometimes that's true, but other times you try over and over and over again until you do it perfectly, exactly the way you wanted to, and it doesn't work. There's nothing else for it, you have to get a higher agility level. It's cool that they made these things obvious for the most part. If you walk along the street looking up, you're probably going to see an agility orb within 10 seconds. But this whole sometimes bit with the creative ways of bypassing level restrictions actually working out is way too frustrating. I feel like it would have been better if they just spaced these objects out to make it clear that these jumps are not possible. Then again, that could be a technical restriction. This was 2007, and this is a big fucking game world. And even if they physically could have done that, I actually think that would be asking too much. Game studios have so much stuff to deal with, and making a game is so fucking hard that I think it's important to be lenient in some of these situations. That being said, who designed the rooftop races? Like, we need to talk!
I just want to talk to him.
So one of the things I found out recently while playing the game again is that walking is actually a pretty good way to set yourself up for a jump. It's still clunky, but it's more bearable than just running across the tip of a billboard expecting things to work out. So why the hell did they think making the player run intentionally as fast as they can while making swerving turns was a good idea? Listen, I love some of these foot races in concept. Climbing the Ferris wheel of a carnival? Awesome. Turning every big boss's abode into an obstacle course? Great. What the hell am I doing up here? Why did you demand of me this sharp turn? If you were going to make turns like this a requirement in any capacity, maybe you should have made them easier to do!
Inhale for 4. Exhale for 4.
So yeah, the foot races are painful. Even the ones I like are irritating in the extreme. But the good news is, you don't have to do most of them. Maybe any of them, even. You are neither expected nor encouraged to find every agility orb and complete every foot race. You are encouraged to do a lot of them, but a lot of orbs plus a few foot races can do the trick. The game is designed so that you'll only have to go looking for stuff like this when you can't reach the next ledge, and when you do go looking, you won't have far to go. This makes a completionist run of this game pretty difficult and rage-fueling, but you don't have to do it. So don't. Seriously. Don't put yourself through that. You deserve better. Oh, and Los Muertos gang members are the easiest to take down in the entire game, so 0 on difficulty. That brings us to a resounding 4 out of 20 on the moral scale for our first gang of the game. Yikes. From here we move on to the Vulk, whose gang members are called Wolves, and who serve under Vladimir the Wolf Golyak, all within their district, the Den. Starting to think I know where Microsoft got their naming inspiration. I'm gonna give this a 1 because it's repetitive, but it's not overly offensive, and nothing else in their initial dossier gave me any warning signs, so... Moving to this place is a serious jump in difficulty. Every enemy's guns are better than Los Muertos, and there's a lot more of them dotting the rooftops. Even better, said rooftops are a lot higher than they were in La Mugre, which means getting up there is a bitch and flying off means instant death. These guys will fuck your shit up, which is awesome because a lot of them aren't actually guys. The Vulk is far more inclusive than Los Muertos, at least in terms of the gender gap. One of these women dropped a fucking cinder block on my head. They do not fuck around. If you have any remaining doubt about that, take a look at the Hotthead. I may have forgotten to talk more about explosives, so let me catch up. The default grenade is not much to look at, but it's not the only grenade you have available at the start. The Colby Limpet charge is probably the only grenade worth bothering with. It has a small detonation radius, but it sticks to whatever you throw it at and detonates when you hold the grenade button. That's right, I'm running around with throwable C4. The tactical use of this is honestly insane. You can blow it mid-air for a direct assault, stack it to a car and drive it through an enemy's gates, pop it on a barrel and wait for someone to walk by. None of this shit matters at all, because the Hotthead is one of 2 rocket launchers in the game. It has a far larger blast radius than any grenade, deals way more damage, and because of that radius, it will always hit its target. This weapon is another reason why cars are useless against almost every boss, because once you leave La Mugre, all of them will have at least one of these. And like any good rocket launcher should, the Hotthead eats vehicles for breakfast. Of course, what this means is that after getting the jump on a group of folks outside my local supply point, I have the Hotthead now, which I will be using with the Harlington for the rest of the game. I'm gonna give the Vulk a 2 for sense and another 2 for difficulty. I will never forget that cinder block. Now it's on to the main event, the Vulk's leadership. My first customer is Natalia White Fox Grisanova. She's a woman who rose through the ranks of the Vulk by seducing the men above her and then taking everything they had, including their rank and lives. This is all intended to make her look like a cutthroat, ruthless woman who will use any means to steal things she didn't actually work to get, but if their fictional world is anything like ours, most white men don't have to really work to get anything. So honestly, slay queen. Unfortunately, she's still one of the only female leaders of the Vulk, and much of her character revolves around the way she looks, so most I can give her is a 1. The only way I could take her out at my current skill ranks was to get to a high point and shoot her with the Hotthead, which trivialized the entire fight, so points for trying, I guess. Skipping past a few supply points I nabbed, I wind up going after Igor Biragov, whose compound I found earlier before I had the Hotthead. Biragov's fine. He's not overly complex, and he's given no straight offensive properties. He's had a long history of hijacking cargo vehicles and then selling the goods inside them to desperate, needy people. And given that the Vulk consistently smuggles in illegal immigrants, it makes sense that there's still a lot of desperate people looking for whatever is in those cargo vehicles. We'll get to those immigrants soon, but for now, just recognize that it makes a lot of sense for someone like Biragov to exist, and it makes a lot of sense for him to have a lot of connections across seas that would allow him to get armored cars using the proceeds he gets from selling the stuff in the cargo vehicles he hijacks. Makes sense for him to be here, makes sense for him to be a general of the gang, makes sense that he has a list of extensive contacts from which he can buy armored cars. Being a mercenary gets you well connected. Biragov gets a 2 for being plausible enough for me to turn my brain off. This is where I'm gonna stop talking about how I kill these bosses, because for the most part, it's all the same. Find a route that's effective, clear out any obstacles on that route, rush into the enemy's compound, and barrage them with so many missiles they can't even react. There are 2 bosses that took a little bit more effort than this, and they both did it in really cheap ways. But aside from those 2, I really don't know what to say. I thinned out Biragov's forces enough to charge through a gap and guarantee a kill with the Hotthead, just like I did with almost every other Vulk boss. So let's speed through these guys. You know how I said the Vulk smuggles in illegal immigrants? That's because of Boris Mikhailov. He brings them in through shipping containers and packs them like sardines. This is to, quote, ensure the survival of the fittest. Except the game undercuts that by saying anybody who doesn't make the grade of new gang members for the Vulk gets let loose onto the streets to distract the agency police. So clearly it's not actual survival, and that makes me question a few things. The first of which being, I'm not sure that they would bother transporting people to then just let them loose scot-free into the city with no genuine repercussions for not being what the gang wants them to be. Like, what is the actual problem that they're facing at that point? Being an illegal immigrant in a strange land without any gang protection? Usually gang protection is just gang extortion, or at least that's how the movies make it look, and let's be honest, given our score for Los Muertos over there, I wouldn't be surprised if that's their only reference. It seems to me like Mikhailov is just dumping the unwanted people out in the streets for no good reason. And that could be a potential liability. Like, if they don't meet your standards for new gang members, wouldn't it be better for you to just kill them? Letting people go if they don't seem like good gang material? That sounds really merciful to me, and not like something the Mafia would actually do. I'm no crime specialist, but I'm gonna give this guy a 0, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. This one needed me to shoot a switch before I could run in and shoot the boss a bunch. Ooh! Viktor Robotnikov is a killing boy who likes killing a lot.
I just love killing.
Apparently, this gives him enough qualifications to be a gun runner. 0, just because you can use the guns doesn't mean that you can transport them. He probably knows how to fix and modify them, but actually running a full-on weapons trafficking business is a completely different ballgame. Plus, being Stabby McMurderton doesn't make a character interesting or even competent. The guy built his base on the water. He has no means of escape and no plan for a guy who runs in with a rocket launcher after that happened to the last 3 bosses I killed. We're giving this guy a 0. I am more disappointed by this next boss than I have been for any before her. That's right, this gang has 2 female gang leaders. The last 2 were hot ladies who used their feminine wilds to hurt men either in or without power. You want to know what this one is? This is her. Her name is Olga Romanova, and she used to be a pro wrestler before she turned to a life of crime. Apparently, she took experimental steroids during her wrestling days that the handler blames for her current appearance. This is disgusting. Let me be clear about something here. Female wrestlers are some of the most amazing people on the planet. Being a woman in today's world is already challenging. Being a physically strong woman in this world ups the difficulty factor considerably. And these women go hard. They put in so much effort every single day for what they believe in. I'm barely a wrestling fan. Most of my exposure has been through Super Eye Patch Wolf. And with just that much exposure, I know these women kick ass. So to have your only representation of a female wrestler in the entire game be doing steroids, presumably for competitive reasons, and still only talk about her looks? There is so much wrong with the way that this game treats women. It is a perfect allegory for the United States. Disregarding the fact that there is no justification given for why this person is chosen to handle the gang's explosives, we're not even given a reason why she would have turned to a life of crime. And the cutscene that plays after I kill her includes a man burying her body in gravel. Poor representation is worse than no representation at all. 0. Sergei Sovetnik Yuriev is a little offensive in a different way. This guy runs the fuel refinery, making sure all the armored cars and carrier vans that the gang has can actually function. Which is actually really cool. The game makes a big deal about the vehicles that the different gangs have, so it's nice that they thought to include where the gang actually gets its fuel from. It's possible a lot of the firefights we've seen between Los Muertos and the Vulk came from not having enough fuel and the Los Muertos guys trying to steal it from the Vulk. That would actually be really neat world building. Yuriev also knows the agency is out to get him, and he's terrified that they will succeed, so he hasn't left his compound in weeks. He's been stuck in the center of his fuel refinery, which makes him a lot harder to get to. This is also really cool. It makes sense that at least one of the people you're hunting will know that you're out to get them, and will be really worried that you're gonna succeed. I just question whether that person would be a member of the Vulk. Again, there's not a lot we know about the Russian mafia, but given that it's referred to as a mafia, we can also assume a decent amount of loyalty is intrinsic to the whole gang. At least to some extent. But if this guy has bodyguards, I don't really see them being loyal to a man who hides under a pillow all day. Buying loyalty can work if you can be sure no one else can pay them better than you. But what's better is to have people working under you who could never be paid off. Now, if these guys are just loyal to the money, that's fine. The game doesn't have to match reality 1-to-1. It does, however, have to remain consistent with itself, and these guys put a muscle lady in charge of their explosives, with no justification given for why she'd be able to do that, no listing about her expertise in the matter. Either the gang cares about its image, or it doesn't. You can't have both. Overall, I think I'm going to give this guy a 1 because he has a realistic job, but is an unrealistic employee. His whole sheltered lifestyle does make this a bit tricky though. This is one of the few bosses I can't just run and gun. I have to shoot these switches, then climb up here, then take out his bodyguards, then I can kill him however I want. Just this much complexity drastically increases the time it takes for me to kill this guy. Particularly when there's so many fuel cans around and his bodyguards have decent artillery. The Grenadier is a grenade launcher, plain and simple. It's effectively the Hothead's little brother, and while it doesn't pack quite the same punch, he do come out swinging though. It's more than enough to blow some of these canisters and send me off with them. I meet these guys with the same force they're using and hop onto Yuriev's perch to kick him in the head multiple times. Which leads us to the Kingpin, Vladimir the Wolf Goliath. His file gives us a lot more world building than any other dossier we've gotten so far. He has extensive military training that has allowed him to succeed as a mercenary over the previous decade, during which time he built up enough connections and earned a big enough reputation to establish his own powerful empire. Pretty standard stuff, nothing too special about him so far, but hold on a second.
Golyak has returned to Pacific City to reclaim control of his troubled organization.
This one line implies a lot. Returned means he left. Why did he leave? Was he pushed out? Did he have better opportunities elsewhere? Did somebody take over? Did the Vulk even exist back then? If it didn't, what was this powerful empire that he built up, and how did it get crushed? I'm gonna try to answer all of these questions by the end of the video, but I just want to point out that they exist to let them marinate in our heads a little bit. Taking this guy down is about as difficult as Yuriev and Garcia were, maybe a little more. If it was harder, then it was for a cheap-ass reason. Getting to the compound is easy enough. I swim around everything, then hop onto this piece of scaffolding on the big pipe at the end. There's one guard here that I kick into the ocean before I very slowly make my way up the pipe. How slowly, you ask? Well, considering I fell 5 times before making any amount of progress through this pipe, I'd place it between the world's fastest snail and its slowest sloth. Yes, I'm exaggerating, but I'm allowed to. I want to emphasize that this camera does not want you to succeed. Nothing is convenient to look at, and the field of view is so tight, I feel like I'm staring down your mom! Once I manage to climb up the water spout, I fight my way up the rest of the compound and deal with Golyak. But making a man my height feel itsy-bitsy put the worst fucking taste in my mouth. In Golyak's death briefing, we get some chilling lines from the handler.
Only when all workers are removed from the streets can we be sure that we have full control over the den.
What the fuck does that mean? By workers, I assume he is referring to the immigrants that were brought overseas. So, is the intention to get them off the streets and into proper housing? Or is the intention to get them into jail cells? I would love to believe it's the former, but knowing the way that this game is portraying the police so far, I'm a little worried that it might be the latter. Also, this'll come up later, but rather than saying, only then will the den be at peace, it's important to note that the handler says, only then can we be sure that we have full control of the den. Most importantly, though, this briefing doesn't cover anything about the empire that Golyak had, about why he left, and what he came back to, what he was trying to take over. So, I'll give this guy a 2, because it sounds like there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. But if it doesn't pan out by the end of the game, and I can't come up with any reasonable explanations, I reserve the right to downgrade him later. This gives us our tentative final tally of 10 out of 20 for the Vulk. It's still a failing grade, but you can really tell that they were trying not to be as immensely offensive this time, you know? I'm sure there's no underlying reason for that at all. Also, after we finish our last firefight with the Vulk, we get a congratulatory video telling us that the last of the workers has been retired. So I guess workers is referring to the gang members? I thought they were called wolves. Still seems a little suspect to me, but we've got only one gang left, so let's get to it. Unfortunately, the Shy Gen are going to be much harder to take down than either of the last 2 gangs combined, and the door to the next area doesn't want to open. So I decide to take a bit of a jaunt through the city before finally finding a highway entrance after passing it like 6 times. Driving my way into Shy Gen territory gets me their intro video, which has a lot of useful world building. The Shy Gen Corporation was founded and funded by the previous government before becoming more powerful than the government that funded it. This implies A, that the current government running the agency overtook the previous government, and B, that the Shy Gen just kind of let it happen because they were already more powerful than the previous government, and I assume that means they were probably able to stop this. Whatever. Through, quote, intensive scientific research, strategic influence initiatives, and black propaganda, which I actually had to look up. Apparently it's propaganda that claims to be from a different source than it's actually from. The Shy Gen became financially independent and more powerful than its initial patron. So, what I said before. This all somehow led to the corporation being purchased by its current head and being renamed to the Shy Gen Corporation. No, we don't get to know what its initial name was. Apparently this also resulted in the birth of the agency, which I would like to remind you all is an organization made up of all law enforcement throughout the entire world. One corporation was created by one government and somehow became powerful enough to warrant all law enforcement in the world unionizing under a single banner. So on the surface level, this makes no sense, right? Especially since this new law enforcement is so focused on capital punishment as its means of officiating itself. How exactly is that supposed to stop white-collar crime? We'll get into it. There's actually an interesting idea behind it. But even disregarding that, most organizations do not employ private militaries, and the ones that do not advertise that. I'm sure it's possible to find out that information if you try, like if you dig far enough you might be able to find something, but you do have to dig. Except the Shaigen is having shootouts in the streets of its own district, the Corridor. That's not exactly a great PR move. Hell, that opens up another question. How is this corporation still standing? Corporations are run by people, not just the people at the top, but the people at the bottom too. If every employee at the lowest rungs on the ladder of Apple just walked out, Apple would cease to exist. It would go bankrupt and lose everything. Now that would never happen in our society because corporations have a strong hold on different job markets and they have an even stronger grip on just about every other market. They work together to make sure that no matter what we do, we're supporting someone we don't want to. That's late stage capitalism, baby. Also, people in this day and age can't just quit on a dime because they're being abused. But suppose that these big corporations had private militaries that were shooting the people in the same country where they live. Not just every so often, not even necessarily a specific ethnic group. The supposed ambiguity of real-world police does not apply here. They are engaging in active shootouts with the cops and with other gangs, and people are getting caught in that crossfire. The members of those gangs and the members of the police have families in the city that are being impacted by those deaths. Some of those impacted will be employees of the corporation, and they're not likely to continue working for them when the corporation is the reason that their brother is dead. When maintaining your current job could get you or your loved ones killed, you're not gonna keep that job. Pretty much everybody caught in that type of situation will just quit immediately. The space they live in, the Corridor, is described as a superficial utopia that takes good care of its numb citizens. But how numb do you have to be to regularly ignore shootouts in the street? The existence of the Shaigen under all of this context makes no sense whatsoever, but in spite of that, I think I'm gonna give it a 2 for now. I won't explain why yet. Just know that I'm going somewhere with this, and we're going to talk about it more during the theorizing stage at the end of this video. The vid also mentions that I'll need a higher agility rank to make good use of the heights, so that's what I decide to focus on for a while. And it's not kidding, these are serious skyscrapers and take a while to scale even on 3 or 4 star agility. I'm at 2 right now, so this is proving pretty difficult. And by difficult, I mean tedious and boring. Finding the right route to take to get to the top of these things takes almost as much time as actually scaling them. Up until now, a building's windows have been a fairly reliable way to climb up it, since most windows have sills. Most of these buildings don't have outward window sills, and because of that, climbing them is non-obvious. I would actually appreciate this change if the buildings weren't so damn tall, but this difference in architecture, coupled with the sheer length of the climb, mixes to create a very frustrating endeavor. It does get slightly better with higher agility, but even then it can be pretty annoying. It also doesn't help that once again, the rooftops are populated with a whole lot of rocket-happy folks. But these ones aren't just equipped with the usual Hotthead, they have the improved version. The Firefly is the second and last rocket launcher in the game, with a slightly lower explosion radius and damage value compared to the Hotthead. So why is it better? Because this sucker has heat seeking, which makes it fantastic for use against mobile targets, i.e. me. To be honest, there's not much reason to swap from the Hotthead to this, because none of the enemies can really outrun the radius of the Hotthead regardless of how bad your aim is. Unless the person in question happens to be standing behind a low wall or on a rooftop that's exactly level with you. But barring those specific circumstances, the Hothead's just better. The nice thing about the folks on these rooftops is they're all tightly grouped together. What, are they in a heavily armed secret rendezvous? This is America. This makes my missiles just as effective as theirs. So what was going to be a rooftop romp becomes a busy day for the fire department. This allows my explosives to climb to 3-star while my agility goes up to 4-star. Somewhere along the way, I actually come across and kill my first target, Dr. Baltazar Chernenko. Remember him? He's the guy who made the genetic enhancement program that gave birth to the main character. In certain respects, he's basically our dad. And just like my dad, he ran off with someone else to father many other children under dubious circumstances, leading those children to become as violent and deranged as I have. His lab is the first place we encounter the Freaks, mutants created through what I assume were failed attempts at a better enhancement set than what we got. After all, there are some notable problems with ours, such as our need to build up to the full effects of the modification rather than having them from the start, and the fact that our physique sometimes works against itself. The Freaks seem to be entirely focused on the physical strength changes, with their muscles bulging out in unpredictable ways. This specific change is successful. These fuckers will throw cars at your head. They hit like a truck when you're right next to them too. It's nice to have an enemy that I genuinely have to use a gun against. I can reach them just fine, but I can't let them reach me. Even the sponginess of these enemies makes sense. They shrug off bullets the same way you do. Oh, right, we kinda skipped over Chernenko's dossier, huh? So as it turns out, Chernenko didn't just invent genetic enhancements. He also invented a mood stabilizer thing. A motion suppressant is what they call it. Basically, it's the way that the Shy Gen keeps everybody numb to all of the shootouts that happen. Maybe mood stabilizer isn't the right word for it. I assume it to be some kind of cocktail of a depressant or an antidepressant, maybe. But basically just a bunch of medication that's meant to assist people with their mental issues. But honestly, who knows what these people are breathing in? Which does beg the question, what about Shy Gen themselves? All of the people that they have working for them, are all of them immunized to whatever this is? If they are, that's probably more harm than good, to be honest, because they're the ones dealing with the most stress on the day-to-day. If they're not, though, they might be less effective as soldiers and scientists. Maybe some people are exempt from immunization for various reasons, like science practices, and I'm gonna give this guy a 1 because he's confusing to me. Speaking of confusing, the biggest problem I run into with most of Shy Gen, but especially Chernenko, is finding any kind of route to my target. Los Muertos heads were all in their little hidey holes, and pretty obvious to spot, giving me free reign of their estates until I managed to take them down. Many of the Vulk behaved similarly, but those that did met me with overwhelming force, and those that didn't either funneled me into a narrow space for a bit, or took a bit of running around to get to my target. Shy Gen is on a whole other level. Every compound feels like my enemy has the upper hand. This is their home turf. They make the rules. They set the boundaries. You want to get into my compound? Good luck finding the entrance. You found the entrance? Well, have fun with my super soldier test subjects. Figured out the freaks? Nice! How many of my other men brought you to critical or gunned you down while you did that? Oh wow, you made it all the way to my room. Too bad there's a pane of fucking bulletproof glass in the way. At any point during this series of obstacles, I could be blown off my feet or straight up killed, which makes the entire process take so much longer. But that's more a sign of the magnitude of this protagonist's power. All these guns and mutants with all their advantageous positions and winding pathways just make the process of killing Chernenko slower. They don't stop us from killing him. Eventually we beat down the blast shield and introduce him to our bullets and boot. Returning back through the skill development trip, we're finally at a high enough agility to effectively kill Thaddeus Oakley. He's the Shy Gen's PR representative. His management of The Message, a nebulous PR campaign, employs subliminal messaging techniques that are, quote, too sophisticated for anyone else to understand. Yeah, okay, Mr. Cartoon Hypnosis Screen must be a real super genius of the human psyche. Assuming we take any of this seriously, which we really shouldn't, why wouldn't this subliminal messaging have already influenced the agency? I see no reason to give this guy the benefit of the doubt. 0. By the way, the necessary agility rank for this asshole is maximal, not even for most of the fight. You do have to approach this guy exactly one way, just like Chernenko, but that path is pretty direct and not too difficult to find. There's a decent amount of obstacles in the way, but that just means I need to wait behind a wall while my health regenerates. No, the reason I need that much agility is for this jump specifically. You cannot make this jump at 3 stars. I have tried. And you can try to kill him without making this jump, but you will be exposing yourself to a downpour of bullets the entire time. And did I forget to mention that every enemy in this game somehow heals at the same rate you do? So ducking back into cover after doing a bunch of damage to him just isn't in the cards. But now, armed with my newfound thunder thighs, I'm finally able to get on Oakley's level and find a new perch for my shoe, which leaves us free to take down the rest of Shy Gen a lot more quickly. Such as Vitaly Rezheznik, security director. This guy apparently runs a private militia to rival the country's official armed forces. Why is this guy not running the corporation? Why is this guy not running the country? Yeah, the obvious reason is someone else holds his purse strings or holds his militia's purse strings, but like, even so, there's too much wrong with this guy. Like, even working directly under his boss and following every order, how would any other gang be able to stand up to him? How would the agency police? How would any of the gangs we've faced so far be able to contend with Shy Gen's sheer power? The fact that there are assault rifles in this game implies to me that nuclear warheads also exist. For any corporation to rival a military power in terms of its effectiveness, they probably need to have one of those. That alone is far too much power for a mere security director to wield. Despite having his own fucking military, he is apparently paranoid and terrified of everyone, to the point where he only trusts one other member of the Shai-Gen, that being Melissa Fang Yin. So he doesn't even trust the CEO of his own company. Why wouldn't Rezhezhnik have already stormed the guy's tower by now? This is another character that makes no sense at all. Zero. His compound is also the most free form of them all. Not many creative routes, but it certainly wasn't difficult to get to him. Even Melissa Fang Yin was harder to reach, and she lives in a big glass ball I was able to jump right into. And you know, I think it says something that this lady literally lives in a glass house as the intelligence director of Shai-Gen. Her intelligence network, quote, relies on the interception and assessment of all communication within the city, as well as anything that flows in or out. Again, why is she not running the company? If we assume that Melissa here is as power-hungry as Natalia was, then she would have already gotten in bed with Rezhezhnik and used her intelligence network and his military to take over the Shai-Gen. And then the rest of the city, because again, military that rivals the nation. How are we even able to fight these people? How are these the two easiest bosses of the Shai-Gen? Also, yeah, the handler told us that Rezhezhnik was no doubt taken in by Melissa Fang Yin's intellect and beauty, which implies to me that she's a lot like Natalia, you know, using men, getting what she wants out of them, and then betraying them later. And honestly based, but like, you didn't go far enough, Melissa. I'm sorry, I gotta give you a 0 for this. It certainly doesn't help that the only other female corporate leader lives right next door to her. Mrs. Timble runs the HR department, which naturally means that she's in charge of training the new recruits in the Shai-Gen's armed forces. Her training is super harsh, bro. Like, anybody who fails it become target practice for the people who don't. She's so evil, man. Seriously, this is what the fucking dossier sounds like.
Mrs. Timble's primary role is ruling Shai-Gen's Human Resources Department, supervising the training of new recruits for the corporation's radical security force. Those who fail her ruthless indoctrination program provide target practice for those who succeed.
It straight up calls her the devil-made flesh and claims that she has no heart or soul. This is also the only elderly woman in the game, by the way. And I do mean the entire game. Everybody walking the street is at most middle-aged. This is one of 3 characters in the entire game who has wrinkles, and you're treating her like this? I wasn't expecting to encounter ageism in this game, but why not add it to the list, I guess? 0. To her credit, Mrs. Timble is real hard to beat. She lives in a glass house too, but hers is surrounded by a concrete structure and see-through walkways that can also be shot through. This does mean you can pop off on the guys above you, but it also means there's little point to gaining a height advantage because it won't make you any harder to hit. All of this, plus the exactly 2 entrances on either side of Mrs. Timble's fortress within a fortress, means actually landing a hit on her without dying instantly is obnoxiously difficult. The only reason I managed to take her out was because she was dumb enough to step out in the open. Otherwise, this fight probably would have taken at least a half hour. But the extra time was made up for when we only have 2 more bosses in the game. Listen, when I said we were speeding through this one, I meant it. Even then, I wasn't expecting the game to only last like 10 hours at most. I definitely didn't max out every skill by the end though, so I guess the developers were intending for people to spend some time running around, shooting criminals, and having fun with it. Which is a trend I'm glad mostly died out in the 2000s. A lot of the entertainment from these sandbox games seems to have been of the make-your-own variety, which is fine for some of them. Minecraft manages to do it because there's just so much to do in that game. And GTA manages to do it because most of the game is intended on you causing chaos. But in Crackdown, you have a goal, and are actively penalized for shooting civilians. How does dicking around help you accomplish that goal? What's the point of raising an arbitrary number? This stuff would be, and to be honest, was, fun for a kid who hasn't played so many games that the reason why he's kicking a man in the face became important, but to an adult who cares about substance, this is pretty devoid of it. The only exception to this is driving. Yeah, I know what I said, the cars in this game are completely unnecessary, you can often move faster outside of them than inside of them, and you never have to step in one to kill a boss. But when you do drive, especially if you have 4-star driving skill, it's actually pretty kick-ass.
Los Muertos gang members are thick on the ground here, Agent. Agency intel suggests an apartment.
I already talked about the supercar and SUV before, but what I didn't mention was that leveling up your driving skill doesn't just make the handling easier or the cars faster, it also improves their abilities. The higher your driving skill, the better the supercar tosses shit in the air, and the faster it accelerates after it's done. Grinding those stars also makes the SUV easier to turn mid-flight, letting you do those sick tricks more effectively, which also boost your driving skill. And did I mention the truck cab because oh my god! This massive monstrosity may be a quick one-way ticket to respawn, but you are going to be taking the entire city with you. Half the time when you die in this thing, it's not even because anyone blew you up, it's because you blew them up a little too close to home. The whole shooting and exploding and running and jumping stuff can all get pretty old pretty fast, and maybe driving through the city can too. But even after documenting every single boss fight in this game, I still remember plowing through people with the truck cab far more fondly than any one of them. Also, at 4 stars in, every agency car gets a special ability. The supercar gets some hood-mounted guns because it just didn't kill fast enough apparently. The SUV gets a jump button for those times when you just can't find a ramp. And the truck cab gets nitro boosting, which lets you pile drive those roadblocks like you're playing Half-Life 2. Some of the things I missed are the DLC packs, or really just pack. 2 of them were free, and I count that as just an update. The Keys to the City cheat mode I've used for some portions of this video was technically free DLC, as was the 4 play pack, which adds 4 new skins for the main character, 2 of which are white, you know, to appease the minority. But the Getting Busy bonus pack used to be somewhere in the ballpark of $5 to $10 if I remember right, which is why I had some weapons and vehicles locked off during my playthrough. But now, not only are all of the DLC packs for both Crackdown 1 and 2 completely free on the Xbox Live Marketplace, so are the actual games. And I'm learning this after I already bought Crackdown 2 so that Shut up. And I'm learning this after I already bought Crackdown 2 off of eBay to make sure that it didn't have any other problematic stuff, and I didn't have to dig deeper down this rabbit hole. Spoiler alert, pretty sure I do. Life sure is funny sometimes. But whatever, this is a thorough review, and we're about to end the game, so let's jump in. The biggest change was 3 new agency vehicles, only they don't change with your level like the last ones do. The buggy is essentially the sequel to the SUV, and in some ways drives better, but in a lot of ways actually drives worse. I swear the cars in this game handle worse the faster you go, which is realistic, but this is not the game for realistic driving. I must go fast, especially when the car has a damn minigun mounted on it, one which I can only assume was meant to be used by a second player. Also, it just kinda looks silly, which I guess does add to the fun factor. I wasn't expecting to drive a clown car today. Speaking of which, the race car looks and drives like the best joke ever. This actually makes me wish I could play this game multiplayer again. Could you imagine signing up for the same road race with your buddy and the both of you are just going the whole time? This thing accelerates and handles like you're playing real Hot Wheels, which is fun as fuck when you're with other kids, but extremely sad when you're alone. The armored car actually sounds really cool when you think about it. The truck cab was obviously meant for driving into enemy bases to get you a head start on murdering, but it didn't really make the cut because you don't have a lot of steam in this thing besides the initial charge. The armored car probably passes that gap if I'm guessing right. Okay, so there's still no point in the cars besides having fun, but for what it's worth, driving around a tank in all but name that fires off homing missiles is pretty damn cool. It's just unfortunate that they reused that missile launcher as its own handheld weapon. Did the same thing for the buggy's gun too. The missile launcher is just a more wonky, less powerful version of the Firefly. You need to be at long range for this thing to hit its target, and even then it's not guaranteed. When you actually do hit something, it's far from a one-shot kill, it barely even sets anything on fire. I did only test this on the ground level, so maybe it works better on rooftops. Either way, I don't think it's helpful for taking out gang leaders. The minigun comes a lot closer. It's actually a reasonable alternative to the Harlington, if you can believe that. It takes a minute to spit up, but every good minigun does. And this fucker chews through health bars way faster than any other machine gun in the game. The spin up is just a tad too much delay for me to put up with, otherwise this would be my go-to weapon for just about every encounter. The only fully original weapon in this DLC pack is the harpoon gun, which is actually seriously good. Strong accuracy, quick reload, one-shot kill, the only thing it doesn't have is a large mag size and replaceable ammo. Otherwise, this would beat out both the Harlington and the minigun. There's also a couple of grenades, but only one of them is an actual explosive. The proximity mine projects a hologram in a radius around it, and if any gang members walk into that, it explodes with a really big radius and a lot of damage. If I'd gotten this DLC before I beat the game, I'd probably have used this grenade as my go-to. Last, and maybe least, we have the cloaking device. It's exactly what it says on the tin, turns you invisible and works as advertised. The only problem is it uses your armor as a charge meter, so the odds of using this to get out of a sticky situation are pretty long. I could see it being effective at getting you up close and personal, but to do that, you have to make yourself easier to kill. It's a neat idea, but it winds up being pretty useless in practice. Alright, we're in the final stretch, just 2 more bosses to go. And these 2 bosses are more difficult and dangerous than the rest by a mile. Both are housed in huge sprawling towers in the middle of the corridor, and neither of them are approachable from the outside. And the easier of the 2 to kill is the one with evident military experience. Colonel Axton Powell is the only black man in the game to my knowledge besides the main character. He's a war veteran who has sustained an injury to his eye, and is basically the best tactician in the entire city, according to the handler, and to me. The other heads of Shai-Gen had at least a little bit of wiggle room with how you approached them. A hidey hole here, a high perch there, somewhere to catch a break or rush in from. Powell owes us no such courtesy. A frontal assault is our only option. Every gun is trained on our location. We either keep moving or die. We pick our targets or they pick us off. He's kind enough to give us 1 elevator up to somewhere close to him, but getting to the man himself requires a feat of agility we didn't used to be capable of. His entire compound is built to make you push to a nigh impassable barrier. If he were dealing with anyone else, he would be invincible. But by this point, we're not just anyone. We leap up these jutting out platforms and fire into his personal globe from the outside. And this, my friends, is characterization through your environment. Every step through Powell's compound tells us more about who he is and how he thinks. He will only hold our hands to lure us into a false sense of security. We break down his doors and cut through his troops only to have an elevator take us most of the way up, like he's inviting us in. His troops are well outfitted, making actually getting to him a hassle, and when we get close, we find that for most people, it would have meant nothing. The only reason we ever stood a chance is because he underestimated us. He's cocky, but he backs up that cockiness with proper planning and guile. I honestly missed this guy after I killed him. He easily had the best compound in the entire game. And his profile was only slightly marred by the handler referring to him as having an all-seeing eye. You know, the eye that was clearly blinded, likely in war? Disrespect for veterans aside, I'm gonna give Powell a 2 and the handler a backhand across the jawline. Which leads us to our final target, a man living just across the way from Powell in yet another sprawling tower. This one has no easy entrance and no elevator to take us up. It is completely unscalable from the outside. Usually when you try to enter through the security doors, the forces manning them will close them before you even get close. You can kill them first to make sure this doesn't happen, but I found that with a high enough agility, you can just run past before they even know what's going on. If you fail to do this, you instead have to find a way in through the garage, which also has electronically sealed doors. It's worth unbarring these from the inside just so agency police can respond to the inevitable firefight and distract some of the Shai-Gen while you make your way up to your target. Which is going to take a while because, yeah, no elevator ride on this tower. Powell's fight is a prelude to this in some ways. You have the same forced route with the same overwhelming firepower that you have to push through in order to reach your destination. It seems to lack the same personality though. Yes, these weird chandelier things fall down on you as you go under them, but they're easy to avoid and don't pose much danger. There are these switches around the complex that guards immediately run to when they see you, which open doors to let in more guys, but that's not the biggest concern when all we need to do is mow them down, hide to recover HP, and eventually just run past them. There are far more corners to hide in than Powell's complex has, which trivializes a lot of this trip. If anything, the fact that you have to run all the way up the tower over and over again every time you die feels incredibly annoying rather than intense. This is interesting because a lot of other games have applied this logic, and it's made some of the most memorable levels in history, but something about this one just doesn't work. And I think I know what it is. Combat just isn't challenging in this game. Picking your position isn't all that hard, recovering HP is obscenely slow for no reason, the TTK on enemies is obscenely high for no reason, and all of these barriers have methods to circumvent them that may be a little janky, but are both more interesting and more fun. Running around in this game feels great when you don't run into a nonsense barrier, so jumping past your enemies becomes both satisfying and the most effective way to deal with them, which does not lend itself well to the fantasy of being basically RoboCop. And this enjoyment only lasts until you find the tiniest ledge that you didn't press A fast enough to jump over on your way. It's like if Mirror's Edge suddenly decided that this little ledge was somehow an impossible barrier. Running up to someone and kicking them in the face is fun as shit, and it feels satisfying to see them ragdoll. The ragdoll physics in this game are actually fantastic. I think I saw someone clip through an object once when ragdolling in both of my playthroughs, which is more than I can say about most modern games that have ragdoll physics. But actually landing those kicks is clunky and annoying, and they don't do nearly enough damage without using the environment to your advantage. Which would be great if this game had physics for objects beyond fall damage or death. Almost, if not every object I picked up was an insta-kill when it hit any part of my opponent. But many of the biggest, coolest objects to throw wouldn't fit into the complexes I wanted to use them in, or broke the moment I was shot at. Explosives are the only part of the game that actually work well when you use them, making them the most reliable way of dealing with enemies when you have to. But your ammo for explosive weapons is limited to about 15 uses apiece, which is actually good design because it forces you to use other avenues of attack. Except that nearly every enemy has grenades on them, and the grenades are at least as effective as the missiles at making opponents ragdoll. Overall, I do think the explosives are the best part of combat design in Crackdown, but that winds up making every other part of it underwhelming, especially the guns. I initially considered doing one of those tier list things to talk about weapons and maybe vehicles and enemies, but this game doesn't have enough variety for that. And even if it did, there's only a couple of guns worth talking about, which are all the guns I've already discussed. Every machine gun and pistol and sniper rifle in this game, minus the Harlington, minigun, and harpoon gun, are most effective when you aim for the head, and actually landing a headshot is finicky at the best of times. Shotguns are rendered pointless by the presence of roundhouse kicks, and newsflash, those are all the weapon categories that use the gun skill. This game's design is bursting with potential, but every aspect of it has one or two glaring issues that occasionally make it extremely irritating to play. And when you add all those inconveniences together, you find something that essentially tries to fight against you having fun with it. Put all of that in a narrow tube that you have to climb up over the course of half an hour, and you get the most irritating boss fight in the game, which is also the last boss fight in the game, unless you're a serious masochist. And it's near the top of this tower that the who of our final boss actually begins to matter, and we finally get to address the elephant in the room. The Shy Gen as a gang are very strangely coded in terms of the issues we've been discussing throughout most of this video. In the video introducing them, we are treated to very traditional Chinese instruments.
Previous government with a remit to evolve radical preemptive defense solutions.
And the name Shy Gen sounds nebulously Chinese in a way that I can't really describe. Like, I don't think it matches Cantonese or Mandarin very well. This name is also not given an English translation, which implies to me that there isn't one. It's just a name. And since we're on the topic, I'm going to give it a 2 because it doesn't seem all that offensive to me. But if anybody out there knows Mandarin or Cantonese and this comes up as a word that could be deemed offensive, please let me know and I will happily downgrade it after the video's over. But it is kind of strange that the intro video has traditional Chinese instruments and the name sounds nebulously Asian in a way that I can't really describe, but the gang leaders are people with names like Chernenko, Rezhezhnik, Oakley, and most of these characters are ethnically Asian and or wearing traditional Chinese clothing, or at least the colors that come with that. Melissa Fang Yin is the only leader with a Chinese surname. Melissa Fang Yin is the only person in the leadership of Shy Gen so far that has a traditional Chinese surname, which, by the way, makes her whole intelligent and beautiful and also cutthroat and ruthless thing way more offensive, so I'm glad I put that 0 there. Most of the gang members also bear similar colors. They show up in black and red to some extent in pretty much every instance. But all of these characters speak with traditional American accents, besides Melissa. Again, glad that Zero's there. I have a few theories as to why the gang is like this. The most obvious one is just that it used to be a different corporation. There wasn't necessarily one culture tied to it. There were a lot of people working here, and all of these people looking nebulously Asian and wearing similar colors is just coincidence. Those are the colors of the corporation, for example. Except red is very clearly the color of the Vulk. Like, the Vulk's symbol is entirely red. Shai-Gen's symbol is entirely white. Why are so many people in Shai-Gen wearing red? I don't know. That's fucking weird, dude. So that explanation doesn't really fly with me. It would make more sense if the writers realized a bit too late that they made a lot of the characters that you kill in this game racially charged and decided to try to fix that by changing the writing. They wouldn't necessarily have had time to change character models, but they could easily change some character names, and that would at least place some ambiguity in there, make it feel less like someone's being targeted. But they also made no effort in regard to that where Los Muertos and the Vulk were concerned, which leads me to another theory. The benefit of the doubt is for people who haven't already proven that they do not deserve it, and I firmly believe that this was a decision by some executive who didn't want to implicate China as a villain in this game. China is a huge market for the US gaming industry. It has been for years, decades by now. The overseas gaming connection is very strong enough to alter League of Legends champion designs, but unfortunately not strong enough to alter Genshin Impact's character designs. So from this point onward, I am going to operate under the assumption that the folks at Real Time Worlds wanted to write an offensive Chinese analog, but got told off by their executives, basically saying, okay, look, the Latin Americans are fine, you can riff off those all you want, same with the Russians, but you do not touch China. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad to say that most of the Shai-Gen are not racist stereotypes in terms of writing and voiceover. I'm just upset that the reasons for that were more than likely monetary as opposed to moral. I mean, what more can I expect from a corporation, but like, still. To support my claims here, let's talk about who actually runs the Shai-Gen. The man who purchased this company, after it had already become as strong as the nation that started it, who bought it out from under everyone's noses, is an extremely Chinese individual by the name of Wang. He is rumored to use dark magics to achieve his ends and maintain an enigmatic air, keeping as much information about himself from reaching the agency as possible. Zero. If you still doubt me, the top of this man's estate houses paper walls and sliding doors, as well as a very Chinese garden and mansion. The second story of which is where we finally find our man. A couple rockets later and the last of our kingpins is dead. Then it's just the final fight with the last dregs of the Shai-Gen, and we get our final cutscene, where the game delivers its magnum opus.
Congratulations, Agent. Peace at last. You overthrew the world's most evil criminal masterminds and their dominant empires. You have returned law and order to Pacific City. You gave the people back their lives. Thank you. It's taken years of meticulous planning and patience to reach this stage, but it was worth it. Who do you think supplied Los Muertos? Who do you think turned a blind eye to the Vulk's activities? Who do you think was Shai-Gen's biggest supporter? Who do you think ran organized law enforcement and ran it into the ground? The people had to experience absolute anarchy before they would accept unconditional control. You are the portent of a new world order, Agent. Pacific City was only the beginning.
I'm gonna start to put together something equating a reliable timeline for Crackdown's story now that we have this last piece of information. At some point in the past, the islands that make up Pacific City were part of a nation that no longer exists by the time the game starts. The handler makes mention of this previous government multiple times when he's talking about Goliath, when he's talking about the Shai-Gen, when he's talking about the agency itself. So based on how much he brings it up, we can assume it was a pretty substantial one. Due to some strange circumstance that we aren't really told about, the world became overrun by crime, which necessitated every law enforcement organization to unite under the banner of the agency. Even that wasn't enough, because the agency didn't want it to be. The people at the top of the agency saw this as an opportunity to wrest control from those who are already in power, possibly inciting a lot of the criminal activity in the first place, and definitely supplying the gangs that were causing a lot of the damage. If any of that sounds far-fetched to you, then it might do you good to remember that the United States has done the exact same thing. The US has a long track record of installing corrupt dictators in foreign nations to ensure trade and guarantee control. Nicaragua, Chile, Guatemala, all of these nations and more had corrupt dictators installed and were provided with soldiers who knew how to effectively hurt and control their citizens. So the agency doing the exact same thing in this game makes a lot of sense. My assumption is that Vladimir Golyak was the leader of the previous government, brought to power by his popularity over the course of roughly a decade of military service. It makes sense historically. Caesar came to power in Rome through the same methods. Whether Golyak was ever a kind ruler to his people is never mentioned. It's not even brought up, like it doesn't even matter. But we do know that these days he's employing a lot of crueler tactics, like bringing in immigrants packed like sardines. But whether that was power corrupting him or him always being that bad, we'll never know. But if we assume that he was the leader of that previous government, then he was the one who founded the corporation that would eventually become the Shaigen. The obvious reasons to do so would have been to research new ways of gaining greater power, greater military power especially, to conquer more nations. But in the process of performing this research, the members of that corporation would find the methods with which to overthrow Golyak. Subliminal messaging, human experimentation, the whole hormone thing. There's lots of ways for them to get the people on their side. But none of those methods would have been a sure thing. Subliminal messaging only works if someone uses modern technology. The whole mutants thing isn't necessarily a great PR move. So the people working in that corporation devised a different strategy. A strategy that would make sure that they would take power and never again lose it, that no one would be able to steal it from them. They decided to go dark, hiding in plain sight with the law enforcement of the government that was slowly being superseded by the Shaigen Corporation. They sold their company to a man who was either in on the conspiracy or would serve well as a patsy, likely misinforming him and telling him that he would be the one to rule the nation. Somebody who would abuse his power and get the people to distrust the corporation. All while its old leaders formed a new corporation, the agency. Somewhere in this process, Golyak was overthrown and came back to try to retake his nation, potentially because he recognized his people were in distress over the new corporation's ownership, but more likely just because he wanted his power back. Sensing a similar opportunity, Garcia decided to bring Los Muertos over to take control of some part of the capital city during all of the chaos. The whole time, the agency put up a veneer of trying to control things while sitting quietly in the keep, perfecting the genetic modification tech they stole from Dr. Chernenko, who they left with the Shaigen Corporation for some unknown reason. Probably because his methods were a bit too gruesome to make an effective PR move, or because they weren't effective in the ways they needed to be. It's telling that the mutants Chernenko creates are stronger than agency police, but not faster, not smarter, can't drive cars or use guns. They are not functioning people anymore. They're people-shaped animals bent on destruction. Even a genius, given subpar equipment, can only do so much, which only makes sense if his resources and funding are not and were never in the hands of Wang, a man who we're told the agency knows little about, despite the fact that the moment we show up to his compound, we get an immediate dossier about him. Which doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it does tell us that what he's doing is likely setting a trap for us. And we get a similar dossier on every single gang member we fight throughout the entire game, despite the fact that the agency demands of us that we find their compound first. Which tells us as players that the agency already knows where all of our enemies are located. They just choose not to tell us. They keep us in the dark just as much as they do the public. They know everything, because they supply everything. The Los Muertos cars, the Vulk's immigrants, the Shaigen's intelligence, all roads lead to the keep. We participated in the world's longest running coup in history, and based on the handler's words, it's not going to be the last. The people will know fear. Fear of disorganization, fear of chaos, fear of crime, and that fear will drive them to desperation. Desperate trust of the agency. they will be willing to get rid of every possible freedom, as long as it means they'll be safe. Safety and survival trump all other needs, always. Now, there are a lot of holes with that theory. I mean, for one thing, the whole subliminal messaging tech is just complete pseudoscience, has no basis in reality at all. Constant advertising will always be more effective than an attempt at subliminal messaging. Not to mention the whole basis that the entire world has somehow been overrun by crime, and also that all lawful organizations have merged into one. Anytime you see that kind of centralization in a story, you can pretty much throw it out, unless it's like an entire world government and we're dealing with a space-age civilization, because at that point, yeah, planets are basically countries. But even then, it's still kind of a stretch, if you ask me. This is still the most plausible idea I was able to come up with. The other theory I had something to do with global warming. And if you accept this theory as our go-to, then it actually seems kind of plausible and interesting to think about. And there's a lot more pieces that could be put together. And I'm sure I could put a lot more work into this to make it more, like, foolproof and seem really, like, solid. But it is at that point that I remember that I'm discussing a game that was made in 2007 and was incredibly tone-deaf at the time of release. So I see no point in putting more effort into that. I recognize that this ending was an attempt by the creators to wake up us white folk who didn't know about the atrocities being committed in Latin American countries by our own people, who didn't know about the atrocities being committed in our own country, to our own people, by our own people. It was a genuine effort by the game itself to point out the atrocities humans are capable of performing upon each other. The ones you perform against the NPCs in the game because somebody told you to. But this ending arrives after more than 10 hours of performing those atrocities without any degree of guilt being shown towards the player at all, which assumes that everyone who's played the game ever even got that far. And along the way, the player is fed script after script about how old people are evil, Latino people are lazy, and women are heartless wenches who won't date me. Many people likely stopped playing when the gameplay got too irritating for them to continue and never got this ending to bring all of that together. I am choosing to believe that the developers wanted to do something good with this game, to at least put the slightest inkling in someone's mind that law enforcement can be mishandled and often is. But that attempt is buried under hours and hours of the player mishandling that law enforcement as the game directs them to, alongside many, many unnecessary comments that retroactively say a lot more about the handler himself than the characters he's talking about. But expecting anyone to put this much thought into a sandbox game about shooting people with as little story as this one has is unreasonable. This is not a game containing lots of NPCs with interesting things to say and a moral to the story. It is a game where you shoot comic book characters that consistently scream shit like "prepare to die" and "I will kill you." I still think it's possible to tell the kind of story they wanted to with this game, but not in America, not in the 2000s. Such a game would require a lot of tongue-in-cheek dialogue, the handler would need to be a lot less professional, and the NPCs would either need to be less racially stereotyped or so racially stereotyped that you can tell it's a joke. I'm thinking Boondock-style representation where you get somebody who's actually from the culture itself to write jokes about the culture. Even better if those characters have details in their voice lines or their environments that tell us about their lives. Preferably funny ones so that we can still enjoy playing the game during this whole debacle. Then you give the player the "you were the bad guy the entire time" speech. Then you make their feelings of humor and joy turn against them and make them feel bad for all of the things they perpetrated in the game. You show them how twisted humanity can be. They'll get over it eventually because it's a video game, and you will get backlash for it, but you're gonna get backlash no matter how you try to do something like this. Frankly, if you're not willing to deal with the backlash of what your media says, maybe you shouldn't be making it. Poor representation is worse than no representation at all. You did good by having only one black character that was a criminal, and having that one black criminal be the coolest one of the entire game. But at nearly every other step, you dug yourselves deeper into the grave you were making. I love political games. I want more political games, especially in the AAA scene where they are incredibly difficult to make. But there are some situations where trying to do something one way can have far worse effects in the opposite direction. I consider Crackdown to be the best example of that in gaming. I have never seen a game this confused in my life, and it honestly sucks to say that, because I have a lot of nostalgia for it. There are many things that I do love about this game. They just can't be allowed to eclipse all of the problematic statements and just general mishandling of so many topics. This game, and games like it, cannot be allowed to fly under the radar again. And if you're thinking it won't, remember that Crackdown 3 released in 2019. And given that another company picked up the IP in 2021, I would not be at all surprised if we see a reboot of this, or maybe another sequel later down the line. It needs to stop. All of it, everything like it, needs to stop. And the best way for us to stop games like this is simply not to play. Stop pre-ordering, stop blind shopping, stop separating the art from the artist. Unless they're dead or something, in which case, go hog wild. Consumption makes the world go round, so to make this world a better place, we need to be better consumers. Read reviews from reputable sources, keep an eye on public discourse, and participate in public discourse. There are people out there who will try to manipulate you to spread a harmful message, whether through malice or ignorance, and the only advantage that we have over them is numbers. So use it.